I still remember the exact moment everything started to unravel, though back then I thought I was walking into a fairy tale. My name is Emma, and this is the story of how I discovered that the man who was supposed to become my father-in-law had been harboring a dark secret for over 2 decades. A secret so twisted that when I finally exposed it, it tore apart everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the lengths people will go to control those they claim to care about. It was a warm September afternoon in Denver when I first met Michael's father. Michael and I had been dating for nearly 10 months, and he'd been building up to this meeting for weeks. He kept telling me how much his dad, Robert, would love me, how I was exactly the kind of woman his father had always hoped he'd bring home. Michael would get this soft look in his eyes when he talked about his dad, explaining how Robert had raised him alone after his mother Catherine died in a car accident when Michael was just 6 years old. The way Michael described it, his father was this pillar of strength who had sacrificed everything to give him a good life, and I couldn't wait to meet the man who had shaped the person I'd fallen so deeply in love with. I spent hours getting ready that day, changing outfits 3 times before settling on a casual sundress that Michael always said brought out the green in my eyes. I'm not someone who typically worries too much about appearances, but something about meeting Robert felt important, like I was auditioning for a role I desperately wanted to land. Michael kept reassuring me during the drive to his childhood home in the suburbs, reaching over to squeeze my hand whenever we hit a red light, telling me stories about how his dad had taught him to ride a bike in the very neighborhood we were driving through, how they'd built a treehouse together in the backyard that was probably still standing. The house was exactly what you'd expect in a middle-class Colorado neighborhood, 2 stories with beige siding and a well-maintained lawn that spoke of weekend dedication. There were rose bushes lining the walkway, their late-season blooms still clinging to life, and a wooden bench on the front porch that looked like it had weathered many seasons. Michael parked in the driveway behind a black pickup truck that gleamed in the afternoon sun, and I took a deep breath, smoothing down my dress one last time before we walked up to the front door. Michael didn't even have to knock before the door swung open, but the man standing there wasn't at all what I expected. Robert was in his early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered with salt and pepper hair that was neatly trimmed. He had the kind of presence that filled a doorway, and for a moment I thought I saw a flash of warmth in his eyes as he looked at his son. But then his gaze shifted to me and something changed. It was like watching a door slam shut. His expression went from welcoming to something I can only describe as revulsion, though it happened so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. The hand I'd extended for a handshake hung awkwardly in the air between us as Robert just stared at me, his jaw working like he was trying to process what he was seeing. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds, and I could feel heat creeping up my neck, that awful feeling when you know something's gone wrong but you don't know what. Michael cleared his throat beside me, and I saw his confusion mirroring my own as he looked between his father and me. Robert finally seemed to snap back to himself, but instead of taking my offered hand, he turned abruptly and walked back into the house without a word. Michael and I stood frozen on the porch, and I slowly lowered my hand, trying to pretend my heart wasn't racing. Michael touched my elbow gently, his face a mixture of embarrassment and concern, and guided me inside after his father. The interior of the house was warm and inviting, with family photos lining the hallway walls and the smell of something delicious cooking wafting from the kitchen. But the atmosphere felt charged with intention I didn't understand. We found Robert in the kitchen, his back to us as he stirred something on the stove. Michael tried to break the ice, launching into an introduction that I could tell he'd rehearsed, talking about my job as a graphic designer, how we'd met at a mutual friend's birthday party, even mentioning the time I'd surprised him by organizing his entire home office while he was away on a business trip. I watched Robert's shoulders tense with each word, his stirring becoming more aggressive until I worried he might break through the bottom of the pot. When Michael finished talking, the silence that followed was deafening. Robert still hadn't looked at me again, hadn't acknowledged my presence beyond that initial horrified stare at the door. I'm not someone who gives up easily, though, so I decided to try a different approach. I've always been good at navigating difficult social situations, a skill I'd developed growing up in a family where we pretended arguments never happened and swept every conflict under increasingly lumpy rugs. So I put on my brightest smile and moved closer to the stove, commenting on how amazing everything smelled. Robert's response was to step away from me like I was contagious, muttering something about needing to check the grill outside. He brushed past me without making eye contact, and I caught a whiff of his cologne, something woodsy and masculine that reminded me of my grandfather. Michael followed his father outside, and through the kitchen window I could see them having what looked like an intense conversation by the grill. Michael's hands were moving animatedly, the way they did when he was upset, and Robert kept shaking his head, his arms crossed over his chest. I busied myself setting the table I'd found in a nearby cabinet, trying to give them space while my mind raced through possibilities. Had I done something wrong? Was there something about me that had triggered such a strong reaction? I'm not a small woman. I wear a size 14 on a good day, and I've had my share of people making assumptions about me based on my appearance. But this felt different, more personal somehow, like Robert had seen something specific in me that repelled him. When they came back inside, Michael looked frustrated and Robert looked resigned. We sat down to eat in the most uncomfortable silence I'd ever experienced. The food was excellent, perfectly grilled steaks with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes, but every bite felt like swallowing sand. I tried several times to start conversations, asking Robert about his work as a contractor, complimenting the house, even bringing up the Denver Broncos, since I'd noticed team memorabilia in the living room. Each attempt was met with single-word answers or complete silence. It wasn't until I excused myself to use the bathroom that things took an unexpected turn. I could hear my name being whispered urgently from the dining room, and I found myself pausing in the hallway, pressing myself against the wall like some character in a spy movie. Michael's voice was clear even in a whisper, demanding to know why his father was being so rude, insisting that he'd been nothing but excited about this meeting for weeks. And then I heard Robert's response, and the words hit me like a physical blow. The thing about overhearing conversations about yourself is that you can never unhear them. Robert's voice was low but clear as he told his son that he couldn't do this, couldn't sit across from me and pretend everything was fine when I looked exactly like her. The her in question wasn't immediately clear, but the pain in Robert's voice was unmistakable. Michael's response was confused, asking what he meant, who I looked like, and that's when Robert said the name that would change everything, Catherine. I looked like Catherine. I stood frozen in that hallway, my mind trying to process what I'd just heard. I looked like Michael's dead mother, the woman who died over 20 years ago. I crept back to the bathroom and locked myself inside, staring at my reflection in the mirror. Blonde hair that fell just past my shoulders, green eyes, a face that I'd always thought was pleasantly average. I tried to imagine what Catherine might have looked like, whether there were photos of her in the house that I'd missed, but I'd been too nervous to really look around when we'd first arrived. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, I tried to act like I hadn't heard anything, but the dynamic had shifted. Robert was looking at me now, really looking, and the expression on his face was heartbreaking. It wasn't disgust I'd seen earlier, I realized, but grief. Raw, unprocessed grief that my appearance had apparently triggered. I felt a wave of sympathy for him, even as I struggled with my own feelings about the situation. It wasn't my fault I resembled his late wife, but I could understand how jarring that must be for him. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. Robert actually made an effort to engage with me, though I could see how much it cost him. His eyes would linger on my face sometimes, and I'd see a flicker of something, memory maybe, or pain, before he'd look away. Michael seemed relieved that his father was trying, but I could tell he was still confused by the whole situation. When Robert excused himself to get dessert, Michael reached for my hand across the table, squeezing it gently and mouthing, "I'm sorry," when his father's back was turned. After dinner, Robert surprised me by apologizing. We were standing on the back deck, looking out at the yard where Michael's childhood treehouse still stood, weathered but intact. Robert's hands were shoved deep in his pockets, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes as he spoke. He told me it wasn't my fault, that I seemed like a lovely young woman, but that my resemblance to Catherine had caught him off guard. He hadn't been prepared, he said, and the grief sometimes still felt as fresh as it had 20 years ago. I found myself reaching out to touch his arm, a gesture of comfort that seemed to surprise us both. I told him I understood, that grief didn't follow a timeline, and that I was sorry for his loss. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes that I couldn't quite identify. Then he patted my hand and suggested we go inside for coffee, and I thought maybe we'd turned a corner. Robert showed me photos of Catherine after that, pulling out old albums from a bookshelf in the living room. The resemblance was indeed striking, though not identical. We had the same colouring, the same general build, even a similar way of smiling. In one photo, Catherine was holding a baby Michael, and the joy on her face was radiant. Robert's finger traced her outline on the page, and he told me stories about her, how she'd loved to dance, how she'd insisted on painting the nursery herself even though she was 8 months pregnant, how she'd had a beautiful singing voice and had loved Madonna's music. Michael sat beside me during this, his arm around my shoulders, and I could feel the tension in his body slowly releasing as his father opened up. It felt like we were building a bridge, finding a way to acknowledge the elephant in the room while still moving forward. Robert even smiled a few times, real smiles that reached his eyes, as he recounted funny stories about Catherine's pregnancy cravings or her attempts to teach him to dance. As the evening wound down, Robert insisted that I stay in the guest room rather than drive back to the city so late. Michael would take his old room, he said, and though I knew Michael wasn't thrilled about the sleeping arrangements, we both agreed it was a generous offer. The guest room was comfortable and clearly well maintained, with soft blue walls and a quilt that looked handmade. I fell asleep feeling hopeful that despite the rocky start, I'd found my place in this family. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the feeling of someone sliding into bed behind me. My first thought was that Michael had decided to break his father's rules, but the body pressing against my back was wrong, too broad, and the smell was wrong too, that woodsy cologne mixed with the sharp scent of alcohol. My blood turned to ice as I realized it was Robert, his arms snaking around my waist as he mumbled Catherine's name against my hair. The scream that tore from my throat was pure instinct, loud enough to wake the dead. I scrambled away from Robert, falling off the far side of the bed in my panic, dragging the quilt with me. The door burst open seconds later, and Michael flipped on the light to find his father swaying on the bed, blinking in confusion. The look on Michael's face as he took in the scene, me cowering on the floor wrapped in a quilt, his father drunk on the bed where I'd been sleeping, was something I'll never forget. It was like watching someone's world shatter in real time. Robert seemed to slowly come back to himself, looking around the room with growing horror, as he realized where he was, what he'd done. He started babbling about thinking I was Catherine, about how sorry he was, how he'd had too much to drink after we'd gone to bed and gotten confused. Michael physically hauled his father out of the room, and I could hear them arguing in the hallway, Michael's voice cracking with anger and disbelief. Robert's slurred apologies echoing off the walls. I sat on the floor for what felt like forever, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't seem to catch my breath. When Michael came back, he looked destroyed. He helped me to my feet, checking me over like he was looking for physical injuries, asking again and again if I was okay, if Robert had hurt me. I assured him that I'd screamed as soon as I'd realized what was happening, that beyond the unwanted cuddling, nothing else had occurred, but I could see that my words weren't really reaching him. We left before dawn, throwing our things into Michael's car and driving away without saying goodbye to Robert. The sky was still dark, just the faintest hint of pink on the eastern horizon, and the streets were empty except for the occasional early morning jogger. Michael drove in complete silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I worried he might crack a tooth. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but every word I thought of felt inadequate. It wasn't until we were back at Michael's apartment, sitting on his couch with cups of coffee neither of us was drinking, that he finally spoke. His voice was hollow as he apologized over and over, saying he never should have taken me there, that he knew his father still struggled with his mother's death, but had never imagined anything like this could happen. I tried to reassure him that it wasn't his fault, that Robert had clearly been drunk and confused, but I could see the shame and anger warring on his face. Over the next week, Robert left dozens of voicemails for Michael, each one more desperate than the last. He claimed to have no memory of getting into bed with me, said he must have been sleepwalking, that the combination of alcohol and seeing someone who looked so much like Catherine had triggered some kind of episode. He swore he was going to get help, that he'd already found an AA meeting, that he'd do whatever it took to make things right. Michael played me some of the messages, and the pain in Robert's voice was genuine, but so was my discomfort. How could I ever feel safe around him again? How could Michael look at his father the same way? The man who'd raised him, who'd been his hero, had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But I could also see how much this was tearing Michael apart, caught between protecting me and not wanting to lose his only parent. A week later, a handwritten letter arrived at Michael's apartment, addressed to me. Robert's handwriting was neat and careful, and the letter was long, rambling in places, but clearly written from a place of deep remorse. He talked about his grief, about how losing Catherine had broken something inside him that he'd never properly addressed. He admitted to drinking too much, to sometimes seeing her in strangers' faces, to sleeping in the guest room sometimes because it didn't feel as empty as the master bedroom. At the end of the letter, he invited us to a family barbecue that Sunday, promising that other family members would be there, that he'd be completely sober, that he just wanted a chance to show us both that he could be the father and future father-in-law we deserved. Michael read the letter with me, and I could see the hope blooming in his eyes even as he told me we didn't have to go, that it was completely my decision. I wanted to say no. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay far away from Robert. But looking at Michael's face, seeing how desperately he wanted to believe his father could do better, be better, I found myself agreeing to go. We'd drive there, I said. We wouldn't stay overnight, and if anything felt off, we'd leave immediately. The relief on Michael's face made me feel like I'd made the right decision, even as anxiety churned in my stomach. The days leading up to the barbecue were tense. I found myself jumpy, startling at unexpected sounds, double-checking the locks on my apartment door. Michael stayed over every night, holding me when the nightmares came, whispering reassurances in the dark. He'd started looking at therapists, wanting to process not just what had happened, but what it meant about his father, his childhood, his understanding of his family history. Sunday arrived too quickly, and as we drove back to that suburban neighborhood, I felt like I was heading into battle. The house looked the same, the roses still blooming, the bench still waiting on the porch, but everything felt different now. There were several cars in the driveway and on the street, which made me feel slightly better. Safety in numbers, I told myself, though I wasn't sure what exactly I thought was going to happen. Robert's sister Linda was the first to greet us, a whirlwind of energy and perfume who pulled me into a hug before I could even introduce myself. She held me at arm's length, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable before declaring that Robert hadn't been exaggerating about the resemblance. Behind her, I could see other family members trying not to stare, their curiosity obvious, even as they pretended to be busy with food preparation or conversation. The backyard had been transformed for the barbecue, with string lights creating a warm glow as the afternoon sun started its descent. Folding tables were laden with food, and the smell of grilling meat made my stomach growl despite my nerves. Robert was manning the grill, looking healthier than he had the week before, his clothes pressed, his hair neatly combed. When he saw us, he raised a hand in greeting, but maintained his distance, which I appreciated. Michael kept me close as he introduced me to cousins and aunts and family friends, his hand never leaving the small of my back. Everyone was friendly, but I could feel the weight of their curiosity, the way their eyes lingered on my face, the whispered conversations that stopped when we approached. It was like being an exhibit at a museum, everyone wanting to see the woman who looked like Catherine, the woman who'd caused such upheaval in Robert's carefully maintained life. As the afternoon wore on, I started to relax slightly. Robert was being respectful, keeping his distance while still being a good host. He'd set up a drink station far away from any alcohol, pointing it out to me with a self-deprecating comment about sticking to lemonade these days. Other family members acted as buffers, keeping conversations light and steering clear of any mention of Catherine or what had happened at my last visit. It was Linda who finally broke the unspoken rules, sliding into the seat next to me while Michael was helping with dessert. She leaned in close, her perfume overwhelming, and started asking about my relationship with Michael. But her questions quickly turned to observations about my appearance, about how I could be Catherine's twin, about how it must be so strange for everyone to see me here, in Catherine's house, with Catherine's son. The way she said it made my skin crawl, like I was some kind of replacement, a ghost wearing Catherine's face. I tried to deflect, to change the subject, but Linda was persistent. She wanted to know if Robert had shown me pictures, if I'd seen how truly uncanny the resemblance was, if I understood why he'd reacted the way he had. Her tone was sympathetic, but there was something underneath it, a sharpness that felt almost accusatory. Robert appeared then, gently but firmly suggesting that Linda help with coffee, and I felt pathetically grateful for the rescue. He took her vacant seat but maintained a respectful distance, apologizing for his sister's lack of tact. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and I could hear children playing somewhere in the neighborhood, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension I felt coiled in my chest. We talked for a while, Robert and I found myself almost liking him. He spoke about his grief with a self-awareness that seemed new, acknowledging how he'd let it fester and control him for too long. He told me about the AA meetings he'd attended, about the grief counselor he'd started seeing, about how my appearance in Michael's life had forced him to confront things he'd been avoiding for decades. When I asked about Catherine, really asked, not just the surface-level stories he'd shared before, his expression changed. He talked about meeting her in college, about how vibrant and full of life she'd been, how she'd made him want to be a better person. But then his voice grew darker as he admitted that he'd been possessive, jealous of her friendships, suspicious of her male colleagues. He'd loved her, he said, but he'd also tried to control her, to keep her all to himself. The admission hung between us, heavy with implications. Before I could respond, Michael returned with dessert, and Robert quickly changed the subject. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, more that Robert wasn't saying. As we ate store-bought brownies and made small talk, I watched him watching me and wondered what else he was hiding behind his remorseful exterior. As the sun began to set and guests started leaving, Robert asked if I could help him find some photo albums in his study. He wanted Michael to have them, he said, pictures of Catherine that his son had never seen. Michael was busy helping his cousins load up their cars, and despite my better judgment, I agreed to help. The study was exactly what you'd expect from a contractor, neat and organised with blueprints rolled up in the corners and invoices filed in labelled boxes. Robert went straight to a bookshelf, pulling out leather-bound albums and stacking them on his desk. He opened one, showing me pictures of a younger version of himself with Catherine, their wedding day, their honeymoon, the day they brought baby Michael home from the hospital. Catherine's smile was radiant in every photo, but looking closer, I noticed things. The way Robert's hand gripped her waist a little too tightly, the way he was always positioned between her and other people, the way her smile seemed forced in some of the later pictures. Then Robert pulled out a manila folder from behind the albums, his movements careful, deliberate. Inside were police reports, newspaper clippings, insurance documents. My blood ran cold as I realized these were from Catherine's accident. Robert's voice was calm, almost conversational, as he told me the official story. Catherine had been driving home from the grocery store when she lost control of her car, crossed the median, and hit a tree. She died instantly. The Honda Civic had been totaled. Her favorite Madonna tape had still been playing when the paramedics arrived. But then he looked at me, his eyes intense, and said that wasn't the whole truth. Catherine had been leaving him, he said. She'd packed a suitcase, picked Michael up from daycare early, and was heading to her sister's house 3 hours away. They'd been fighting for weeks, months really, about his jealousy, his need to know where she was every moment of the day. She'd finally had enough. I stood up, my heart racing, but Robert kept talking, his voice taking on an edge I didn't like. He pulled out more papers, witness statements that mentioned a black pickup truck following Catherine's car aggressively before the accident. His black pickup truck, though that detail hadn't made it into the official report. He just wanted to talk to her, he said, to convince her to come home. But she'd been driving too fast, trying to get away from him, and when he'd gotten too close, she'd swerved. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I backed toward the door, but Robert stood up too, the papers clutched in his hands. He started talking faster about how it had been an accident, how he'd never meant for her to get hurt, how he'd loved her too much to ever intentionally harm her. But his eyes were wild now, unfocused, and I realized with growing horror that he wasn't really talking to me anymore. He was talking to Catherine. Michael's voice calling from the hallway broke whatever spell had fallen over the room. Robert's whole demeanor changed instantly, his face smoothing into a mask of normalcy as he casually placed the papers back in the folder. When Michael appeared in the doorway, Robert smiled and gestured to the photo albums on the desk, saying we'd found some wonderful pictures for him to take home. The drive back to the apartment was quiet, but my mind was racing. Should I tell Michael what his father had revealed? Was it even true, or was it the rambling of a man still destroyed by grief? The photo albums sat in the back seat like accusations, and I kept glancing at Michael, trying to imagine how he'd react to learning that his father might have been responsible for his mother's death. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m, the same time Robert had crawled into bed with me, I got up and made tea, sitting at Michael's kitchen table in the dark. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was short, just a few words, but they made my blood run cold. Please don't tell him. He doesn't need to know. I knew without question it was from Robert. I showed Michael the text when he woke up, and his face went pale. He tried calling his father, but Robert denied sending anything, claimed his phone had been with him all night. When I went to show Michael the text again, it was gone, deleted somehow, and I felt like I was losing my mind. Michael believed me. I could see it in his eyes, but without proof. What could we do? More texts came over the following days, always from different numbers, always deleted within minutes of my reading them. They grew more urgent, more detailed. Robert wanted to meet with me alone, wanted to explain everything properly, wanted me to understand that Catherine's death had been a tragic accident, nothing more. Each message felt like a threat wrapped in a plea, and I started documenting them, taking screenshots the moment they arrived. Michael confronted his father again, this time at a restaurant, neutral territory where Robert couldn't make a scene. I went with him, despite Robert's clear displeasure at my presence. The conversation was tense, with Robert denying everything, the texts, the confession about Catherine leaving him, all of it. He looked at Michael with such hurt in his eyes, asking why his son would believe a stranger over his own father. But I wasn't backing down. I asked pointed questions about Catherine's death, about the black pickup truck, about why she'd had a suitcase in her car. Robert's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of rage crossing his face before he composed himself. He accused me of trying to tear apart their family, of being jealous of Catherine's memory, of making up stories for attention. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost doubted myself. Michael was torn. I could see it. His whole life, his father had been his hero, the man who'd sacrificed everything to raise him alone. And now here I was, suggesting that same man might be a killer. We left the restaurant with nothing resolved, Robert playing the wounded father to perfection, while I felt like a villain for speaking the truth I'd heard from his own lips. That night, Michael made a decision. We were going to find out the truth, with or without his father's cooperation. He still had a key to the house, and he knew his father kept important documents in the attic. While Robert was at his AA meeting the next evening, we'd search for evidence, for anything that could prove or disprove what I'd heard in that study. The attic was stifling, filled with decades of accumulated belongings. We found the boxes almost immediately, labelled with Catherine's name in Robert's neat handwriting. Inside were things that made my stomach turn. Photos of Catherine taken without her knowledge, at the grocery store, at the park with baby Michael, talking to other mothers at playgroup. Each photo was dated and annotated in Robert's handwriting. Talking to unknown male, 2:15 p.m. Third time at park this week. Why? Says she's going to Sarah's. Verify? There were journals too, Robert's daily logs of Catherine's activities, his suspicions, his plans to install recording devices in their home. The final entries were frantic, angry, accusing Catherine of having an affair, of planning to leave him, of trying to take his son away. The last entry was dated the day she died. She thinks she can leave me. She's wrong. We found the witness statement about the black pickup truck, the one that had somehow never made it into the official report. We found receipts for repairs to Robert's truck dated just days after Catherine's death. We found Catherine's diary hidden at the bottom of a box, her own words documenting Robert's escalating control and her desperate plan to escape with Michael. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and heartbreaking. Michael sat among the scattered papers and photos, tears streaming down his face as he read his mother's words, as he understood finally what had really happened. His whole life had been built on a lie, raised by the man who had very likely killed his mother, whether intentionally or not. We heard the front door open downstairs, Robert calling out Michael's name. He was home early from his meeting, and we scrambled to pack everything back into the boxes. But there was no time to return them to their hiding spots. Robert's footsteps were already on the stairs leading to the attic, and Michael and I looked at each other, knowing there was no avoiding the confrontation that was coming. Robert's face when he saw us there, surrounded by Catherine's things, was terrifying in its blankness. He didn't yell, didn't rage. He just stood there, looking at the evidence of his obsession spread out around us. And for the first time, I saw him for what he really was, not a grieving widower, but a man who had loved so possessively that he'd destroyed the very thing he claimed to cherish. The conversation that followed was ugly. Robert tried to justify everything, to explain that he'd only been protecting Catherine, that the world was dangerous and she'd been too trusting. When Michael confronted him with the diary, with Catherine's own words about wanting to leave, Robert's composure finally cracked. He admitted to following her that day, to trying to force her off the road just to make her stop, to talk to her. He swore he hadn't meant for her to hit the tree, that it had been an accident. But Michael wasn't buying it anymore. The man who'd raised him, who'd coached his little league team and helped with homework and been there for every milestone, was also the man who'd stalked his mother, controlled her, and ultimately been responsible for her death. The betrayal was written across Michael's face, and when Robert reached out to him, Michael recoiled like his father's touch was poison. We left that night with boxes of evidence, despite Robert's attempts to stop us. He grabbed my arm at one point, his grip painful, hissing that I'd destroyed everything, that I'd turned his son against him just like Catherine had tried to. Michael shoved him away, standing between us, protecting me from the man who'd raised him. The look they exchanged in that moment was the end of everything they'd been to each other. 3 months later, I was sitting in our new apartment in Portland, watching the rain streak down the windows. We'd moved across the country, needing distance from everything that had happened. The investigation into Catherine's death had been reopened based on the evidence we'd provided, and while Robert hadn't been charged with murder, the obstruction of justice and evidence tampering charges were likely to stick. Michael was in therapy 3 times a week, processing not just the truth about his mother's death, but the realization that his entire childhood had been shaped by her killer. Some days were harder than others. He'd remember good times with his father and feel guilty for the memories, then feel angry for feeling guilty. It was a long road, but he was walking it. I'd cut my hair short and dyed it dark, partly because I needed a change, partly because I couldn't stand seeing Catherine's face in the mirror anymore. The resemblance had brought truth to light, but it had also cost us both so much. Michael assured me daily that he loved me for me, not for any ghost I might resemble, but I still sometimes caught him looking at old photos of his mother with an expression I couldn't quite read. We'd kept one photo album from the boxes we'd taken, the one with pictures of Catherine before she met Robert. In those images, she was young and carefree, laughing with college friends, backpacking through Europe, living a life that was entirely her own. Michael liked to look at those pictures, to imagine the person his mother had been before his father's obsession had trapped her. On quiet evenings, we'd cook dinner together in our small kitchen, music playing softly in the background. We'd carefully avoided Madonna for months, but one night, Like a Virgin came on a random playlist, and instead of changing it, we let it play. Michael pulled me into his arms, and we swayed together in our kitchen, thinking of a woman neither of us had really known, but whose story had changed both our lives. The truth about Catherine's death had set us free, but freedom came with its own weight. We carried it together, along with the knowledge that sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones capable of causing the deepest harm. But we also carried the proof that truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of surfacing, and that love, real love, doesn't seek to control or possess, but to protect and support. Some nights I still dream about that moment in Robert's study, about the wild look in his eyes as he told me about Catherine trying to leave. In my dreams, sometimes I'm myself, and sometimes I'm her, running from a black pickup truck that gets closer and closer no matter how fast I drive. I always wake up before the crash, gasping and reaching for Michael, who holds me until the shaking stops. But more often now, I dream of other things. Of the life Michael and I are building together, of the family we might have someday, of children who will know their grandmother's story not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder to love freely and live authentically. We keep Catherine's diary in a safe deposit box, her words a testament to a woman who tried to save herself and her son, who was brave enough to plan an escape, even if she didn't live to see it through. Robert still tries to contact Michael sometimes, letters forwarded from their old address, voicemails left at odd hours. They all say the same things, that he's sorry, that he loved Catherine, that everything he did was out of love. Michael doesn't respond, but he doesn't throw them away either. They sit in a box in our closet, evidence of a complicated grief that may never fully resolve. I think about Linda sometimes, about her comment that I was sitting in Catherine's house with Catherine's son, and I realise now that she was wrong. It was never Catherine's house, it was Robert's, a prison disguised as a home. The house Michael and I are making together is something different entirely, built on truth and mutual respect, and the hard-won knowledge that love should free you, not cage you. The investigation is ongoing, the lawyers tell us, but these things take time. 20-year-old evidence is hard to prosecute, and Robert has good lawyers of his own. But we've done what we could, brought the truth to light, given Catherine a voice after decades of silence. Whether or not Robert ever faces legal consequences for her death, he's lost the thing he valued most. His son, his carefully constructed narrative, his image as the devoted widower. The truth has stripped all that away. Some people have asked me if I regret getting involved with Michael, knowing how it all turned out. They wonder if I wish I'd never met Robert, never triggered his memories of Catherine, never uncovered the truth that shattered Michael's world. But I can't regret it. Catherine deserved to have her story told, and Michael deserved to know the truth about the woman who'd given him life and the man who'd raised him. We're planning to visit Catherine's grave next month, on the anniversary of her death. Michael wants to bring flowers to tell her that we know what happened, that her son is free from the man who hurt her. It will be the first time he's visited since learning the truth, and I know it will be hard for him, but I'll be there, holding his hand, reminding him that he's not alone in this. The truth is, we're all haunted by something, by the ghosts of who we were, who we might have been, who we lost along the way. But we don't have to let those ghosts control us. We can acknowledge them, honor them, and then keep living. That's what Michael and I are trying to do, one day at a time, building a life that Catherine would have been proud of. And sometimes, late at night when the rain is falling and the world feels quiet and safe, I think I can feel her presence. Not in a supernatural way, but in the strength Michael shows every day, in the way he's chosen to break the cycle of control and possession, in the love we share that asks for nothing but honesty and kindness. Catherine may be gone, but her courage lives on in her son, and in the truth that finally, after all these years, set them both free. The story could end there, but life rarely provides such neat conclusions. We still have hard days, days when the weight of everything feels too heavy to carry. Days when Michael questions every happy memory from his childhood, wondering what was real and what was performance. Days when I catch a glimpse of my reflection and see her face instead of mine. But we also have good days, more and more of them, days when the past feels like something we've survived rather than something we're still drowning in. I've started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. There's something therapeutic about creating something from nothing, about choosing each colour and stroke deliberately. My latest series is abstract, all blues and greys and sudden bursts of yellow, like sun breaking through storm clouds. Michael says they remind him of hope, and maybe that's what they are. Visual representations of the belief that no matter how dark things get, there's always the possibility of light. We've made friends here in Portland, people who don't know our history, who see us as just another young couple trying to make it in an expensive city. There's freedom in that anonymity, in being able to define ourselves by who we are now, rather than what we've been through. But we've also found a support group for families affected by domestic violence, because that's what Robert's treatment of Catherine was, even if it took us too long to name it. The facilitator of the group, a woman named Maria who lost her sister in similar circumstances, told us something in our first meeting that stuck with me. She said that abusers often genuinely believe their own narratives, that they've convinced themselves that their actions come from love rather than control. It doesn't excuse what they do, but it helps explain how someone like Robert could live with himself for 20 years, raising the son of the woman he'd killed, maintaining the fiction that he was the grieving widower rather than the cause of the grief. Michael has started writing letters to his mother, things he wishes he could tell her, memories he wants to share. He doesn't send them anywhere, just keeps them in a journal that he sometimes shares with me. They're heartbreaking and beautiful, full of the small details that make up a life. How he still makes his eggs the way she taught him, even though he was so young when she died that the memory might be more wish than reality. How he chose his career in environmental law because she'd loved nature, used to take him on walks to collect leaves and identify birds. We've talked about having children someday, and it's a conversation layered with complexity. Michael worries about carrying his father's genetics, about whether there's something dark in his DNA that might surface. I remind him that he's already proven he's nothing like Robert, that genetics isn't destiny. But I understand his fear. When you've seen how love can be twisted into something destructive, it's hard to trust that you won't repeat those patterns. But I have faith in us, in the life we're building brick by brick, truth by truth. We've seen the worst of what can happen when love becomes possession, when grief becomes obsession, when lies become the foundation of a life. We've survived it, exposed it, chosen a different path. That has to count for something. Last week, we got word that Robert had been sentenced to 2 years for obstruction of justice. It's not enough, not nearly enough for what he did to Catherine, but it's something. Michael didn't attend the sentencing, but I did, sitting in the back row of the courtroom as Robert, looking older and smaller than I remembered, was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge my presence, and I was grateful for that small mercy. After the sentencing, I drove to the cemetery where Catherine is buried. It was a beautiful day, the kind of crisp autumn afternoon that makes you grateful to be alive. I'd brought roses from our garden, pink ones that reminded me of the bushes at Robert's house, though these ones were free of the associations that tainted those. I placed them on her headstone and sat in the grass, talking to her like she could hear me. I told her about Michael, about the man her son had become despite everything. I told her about our life in Portland, about the way he still hums when he cooks, just like she used to. I told her about the investigation, the trial, the small measure of justice we'd managed to secure. And I promised her that we'd keep living, keep loving, keep telling the truth even when it was hard. As I was leaving, an older woman approached me, asking if I'd known Catherine. When I explained who I was, her face softened with recognition. She introduced herself as Catherine's college roommate, someone who'd lost touch after Catherine married Robert. She told me stories about the woman Catherine had been before, vibrant and independent and full of dreams. She said she'd always wondered what had happened to her friend, why she'd seemed to disappear after the wedding. We talked for over an hour, sitting on a bench near Catherine's grave, and when we parted, she pressed a photo into my hand. It was of Catherine at maybe 20, laughing at something off camera, her whole face alive with joy. This was who she really was, the woman said. Before him, remember her like this. I keep that photo on our dresser now, next to one of Michael and me from our trip to the coast last month. 2 women who look alike but lived very different lives. One cut short by obsessive love, one still in progress. Sometimes I catch Michael looking at both photos, and I know he's thinking about paths not taken, lives not lived, the mother he barely knew, and the woman he's choosing to build a future with. The resemblance that once seemed like a curse now feels more like a responsibility. Catherine couldn't escape, couldn't save herself, couldn't raise her son. But her story, brought to light by the accident of our similar faces, might help someone else recognize the signs, might give someone else the courage to leave before it's too late. That's the hope I hold on to when the weight of it all feels too heavy. We're planning to start a foundation in Catherine's name, something to help women in abusive relationships, particularly those dealing with stalking and coercive control. It's still in the early stages, but Michael has thrown himself into the planning with an energy that tells me this is part of his healing. Taking something terrible and transforming it into something that might help others, that's a kind of alchemy I can believe in. Robert will be out of prison in less than 2 years, a thought that sometimes keeps me up at night. We have restraining orders in place, have taken all the legal precautions we can, but paper doesn't stop someone determined to cause harm. We've talked about what we'll do when he's released, whether we'll need to move again, change our names, disappear more thoroughly. But we're trying not to let fear dictate our choices. We've built a life here, and we don't want to give that up unless we absolutely have to. In the meantime, we live. We go to farmers' markets on Saturday mornings, arguing playfully over which tomatoes to buy. We have game nights with friends, where Michael's competitive streak emerges and makes everyone laugh. We take weekend trips to the mountains, hiking trails that Catherine might have loved, breathing in the pine-scented air and feeling grateful for the freedom to go where we please. And slowly, carefully, we're learning to separate the past from the present. to honor what happened without being imprisoned by it, to build something new on the ashes of what was lost. It's not easy, and there are days when the grief and anger feel fresh as ever. But there are also days when we forget to be sad, when we're just two people in love, making dinner and planning our future, and believing that happiness is possible, even after everything. Catherine's story didn't end the way it should have. She should have made it to her sister's house that day, should have raised Michael, should have had the chance to build a life free from fear and control. But her story isn't over, not really. It lives on in her son's determination to be better than what he came from. It lives on in the truth finally being told. It lives on in every woman who recognizes the warning signs and gets out before it's too late. And it lives on in me, the woman who looked like her enough to trigger an old man's guilt and unravel decades of lies. I never asked for this resemblance, never wanted to be the ghost at the feast. But maybe that's exactly what Catherine needed. Someone with her face but not her fear. Someone who could help her son uncover the truth she died trying to escape from. The sun is setting now outside our Portland apartment, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Michael will be home from work soon, and we'll make dinner together, maybe open a bottle of wine, definitely end up slow dancing in the kitchen to whatever music strikes our fancy. It's a simple life, a good life, one Catherine would have wanted for her son. And sometimes, when the light hits just right, when I catch my reflection in our kitchen window, I don't see her anymore. I just see myself, Emma, a woman who fell in love with a good man, who helped uncover a terrible truth, who's building a life based on honesty and respect and the hard-won knowledge that love shouldn't hurt. That's the greatest tribute I can offer to Catherine's memory, to live the life she couldn't, freely and fully and without fear. The story goes on, day by day, choice by choice. We carry our ghosts, but we don't let them steer. We honor the past, but we don't live there. We tell the truth, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because in the end, that's the only way to really be free. Catherine knew that. She tried to claim that freedom for herself and her son. She didn't make it, but we did. And we'll keep going, for her, for ourselves, for the future we're building one honest moment at a time. Tonight, when Michael comes home, I'll tell him about visiting his mother's grave, about meeting her college friend, about the photo that shows who she really was. He'll probably cry and I'll hold him and we'll order takeout because neither of us will feel like cooking. We'll look at the photo together, seeing not just Catherine but the life she should have had, the joy that was stolen from her. And then we'll keep living, because that's what you do. You take the broken pieces and you build something new. You refuse to let tragedy have the last word. You love with your whole heart, even knowing how much it can hurt. You tell the truth, even when lies would be easier. You choose hope, even when the darkness feels overwhelming. That's Catherine's real legacy, not the way she died, but the courage she showed in trying to live. And that's the inheritance Michael and I will carry forward into whatever comes next. The ghosts are quiet tonight. The truth has been told. And somewhere I'd like to think Catherine is finally at peace, knowing her son is free, knowing her story didn't end in that crumpled Honda Civic, but continues on in every choice we make to love better, live fuller, and never let fear disguise itself as love again. That's our promise to her memory and to ourselves, and we intend to keep it, one day at a time, for the rest of our lives.